who is here as a witness? Joan and Kristen, okay, and David Hall. So late last night, I realized that we probably uh, didn't incorporate some of the testimony from last week into a new version. So I shot off some of my thoughts to David and to everybody at this point. But we should maybe, I don't know if David has any additional things that he heard that he has questions about. If not, and we could find that by walking through that annotated draft, and I can explain my chicken scratch and as to what I heard the department, the agency saying they wanted, and other committee members saying they wanted as potential changes to this bill. So unless somebody has a better idea, I'm sorry, let me turn off my background noise here.
Okay, I'm
Much better. Okay.
a big improvement.
Yes. Can David or Nathan pull up the S62 with my comments in caps that I put in various places? And we can just walk through that again.
Give me just 1 second. I can pull that up. This one. How does that look?
I don't see-
Small. It looks very small. But you know what? If it's on our website, we'll do. It's on our website, so I'm just pulling it up. It should be.
I don't see it on our screen either.
Sorry, I actually took it down. I was trying to make it bigger. Is it there with the box on the side?
Yep, I got it now. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I can make it out. If you can make it a little larger, it'd be better, but.
Yeah, I don't see Wednesday's stuff up on the website, so I'm gonna look under the bill.
Well, Allison, this is.
Yeah. Oh, good. That's bigger. That's bigger. Even I can read that.
This version is the one with my annotations.
Oh, right.
David?
Right.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and I'm not sure this got posted yet. It can be
Got
posted
it.
now.
Okay.
Actually, if you haven't posted it, Nathan, don't post it. People can watch it on the screen right now. There's a lot of typos. It's just really
Okay.
work in progress. We'll have David clean it up after this, but let's walk through it.
Sure. So, David Hall, Legislative Counsel, you should be viewing an S62 draft, and I think we'll go through and identify issues as the chair indicated, and this does have some of his thoughts on it. And we did have a prior hearing where some issues were raised. So I'll try to make sure I've gathered all of those points. You'll recall this is creating in Title 10, Chapter 1 currently is sort of the permanent economic development programs that have been codified, and this would add to it the new Vermont Employee Incentive Program. I think there was a question about the name.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
Sort of the first point of the program.
Okay, let's talk about that. What was the question? It doesn't jump out at me as being offensive as is, but
I thought, Mr. Chair, that you had wanted to actually have it named the Relocated Worker Program or New Vermont, something with relocated incentive instead of employee incentive.
Thank you. Yep. Yeah, I think at least get the word relocated in there, which incorporates both people still working for out-of-state firms and Vermont firms, but who have
So-
come from afar. So New
How
Vermont,
about getting rid of the word new and just saying relocated Vermont employee incentive program?
I like new,
Oh, you do? Okay.
just because it's someone who recently has come here.
Well, then how about new?
Vermont Relocated Employee Incentive Program. Just put the word relocated in there. We can move on and we can come back to this if people have a better idea. We'll figure that one out. That should be the biggest problem we have.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
David.
A is pretty standard language, just tells the agency to shall design, implement, program, award incentive grants, qualifying new employees as provided in the section and subject to the policies and procedures the agency adopts.
And let me just say for Keisha's benefit mostly, just in case it's not clear, it probably is, that what we're doing is we started out with a remote worker program. The following year, we added a relocated worker program for people who were coming to work for Vermont employers. And this bill will merge them into one program now called the New Vermont Relocated Employee Incentive Program, if that's the term we have. So that's all we're doing here is establishing this combined program in statute. There's session law, I guess, on both of the other programs that exist, but they don't have a place in the green books yet.
Sounds good.
So any objections to subsection A?
Nope.
All right. B, a qualifying new employee may be eligible for a grant under the program for qualifying expenses. And remember, those terms are all defined below, subject to the following. So, this is a significant part. Obviously, this has the concept of the base grant at 5 and then an enhanced grant not to exceed 7,500 for a qualifying new employee who becomes a resident in a labor market area in the state. And as I mentioned before, A and B are the standards that we currently have in other programs, VEGI and the training program, where average annual unemployment in the LMA is higher than the state, or the average annual wage in the state exceeds the wage in the LMA. So two concepts, first, what are the appropriate amounts? And second, do you want the enhancement? And I guess third, is this the right basis for the enhancement?
And for those of us who I'd love clarity on those areas. Are those our opportunity zones? Or those are can you just remind us the labor market areas, can you just remind us about what they look like? Give us a picture of them.
It's a fair question. I haven't looked at that map in a few years. It's all designated by our Department of Labor, and
it does it mean that employment is above a certain, unemployment is above a certain amount, or what's the trigger that identifies it and creates a special area?
I don't remember the basis of the demarcation. Maybe Joan does.
Joan have?
Yeah, it's defined there. There, each year there's I think it's an average for the state. It's where the unemployment is higher in those regions than the statewide,
Right.
and where the wage is lower. And each year they're designated, and think about it as areas outside generally. I mean, I'd have to look at, there's a page where we have that outline, but it's outside of the Burlington MSA. It's outside of the Central Vermont, Montpelier, Barre area. Many of the others fall into the LMA, not all. I'm being very general, but it's a designated methodology. It happens every year. We use it in the veggie program, and it's a way to
Right.
incentivize people outside of Chittenden.
Yeah, thanks. I just needed a reminder.
All right.
Thank you.
Just so you know, Keisha, last session, there was a lot of talk and optics about two Vermonts, Chittenden County and the rest of the state. And this is one of our efforts to promote economic development in the more struggling areas.
Yeah.
So it's based on the decennial census, using that federal data, and so the labor market areas, I don't know if it would be helpful for me to pull this up on the screen. I'm looking at it on the Department of Labor's website. But I'll just read to you to give you a flavor of what they are. Barry, Montpelier, Bennington, Brattleboro, Burlington, South Burlington, Colebrook, New Hampshire to Vermont, Derby, Highgate, Littleton, New Hampshire into Vermont, Manchester, Middlebury, Morristown, Waterbury, Newbury, North Adams, Mass into Vermont, Northfield, Waitsfield, Randolph, Rutland, Springfield, St. Jay, White River Junction, Woodstock. And so those are, if you were to project those onto the map, they're little blobs of, certain number of population and geographic space based on census data. Again, our Department of Labor, the LMI division, establishes what those are based on the census data. And then the trigger under this bill and under the programs that use it is, relative to the state, are things more challenging in that LMA relative to the state number, whether it's unemployment or it's wage.
Thank you.
And
I wonder
Joe-
if I could ask a question here.
yes,
And that is, in terms of the labor market areas, some of them geographically are not tiny, and some of them cross state lines. Are there any implications? And I'm not sure, David, you may not know this, but it's just a question that perhaps the department does, of whether or not there are differences in wage rates that are just state related. And so that, for example, if you took the area that crossed the border with New Hampshire, where New Hampshire's minimum wage is substantially less than Vermont's, is there a weighting that reduces that labor market area average wage just because of the geographical difference? And similarly, as we look at at Massachusetts, I would suspect that the wage rates in northern Massachusetts might be higher than those in southern Vermont. And so a similar question. Do we know that?
I think it's a great question. Honestly, if you wanted to get into that level of data analysis, I would recommend you hear from Matt Barowitz.
Matt Barowitz.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
so
Yeah.
just and to put this in perspective, I realize we want to do well in terms of targeting, but this distinction between 7,500 and 5,000 has existed at least for a year in the relocated worker program. Have
Right.
you seen any problems with implementing it, or people being concerned about it? Or, I mean, it may not produce perfect results, but it seems to work in other programs. I'm inclined not to upset the apple cart with getting into drilling down into more minutia here, if it seems to be working as is.
I tend to agree with that statement, if that was directed toward me.
I'm glad you agree, but I was also asking a question. Have you seen any problems?
I haven't. I don't know, Kristen, if you want to answer that, but none that came to my attention about it.
No, we haven't had anybody concerned with this, any of the applicants. Nobody.
Thanks.
Okay, can we move on, David?
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely. Let me switch back here. So On subsection C, again, this is pretty standard language until we get to the date. So the agency shall adopt procedures for implementing, which include a simple certification process to certify qualifying new employees, expenses, promote awareness, and through trade group coordination, et cetera. So award grants in 3. Award grants to qualifying new employees on a first come, first served basis beginning on January 1st, 2021, subject to available funding, and then 4, adopt goals, et cetera. So there's a question here the chair raised in his note, and that was also raised in the hearing last time, which is this January 1 date. And
Yeah, so my understanding is that we have several hundred people lined up and we have carry forward funds for the relocated worker program. That's all we have legal authority to spend money on right now is on the relocated worker program. And that amount of money that we have in the bank carry forward could pay for several hundred, I don't know if it's 500, but you anticipate it being about 30 people short, which is if you use $4,000 grant, that's $120,000 short. I'm not understanding, Joan, quite frankly, why that carry forward program just doesn't continue to exist to the normal effective date of July 1st. You get that money out the door and all these new programmatic changes become effective on the normal effective date of
Right,
July 1st.
right. That's a good question.
So, in other words, that this would be effective July 1st, 2021. And yeah, and everybody in the queue would either be funded, and if they weren't funded, I guess we're just concerned if they weren't funded because we ran out of funds, would they lose their line, their spot in the queue?
One simple way to do it, and I'm not sure if there'd be problems you need to think about it, is we could sort of grandfather those people in with a simple sentence and let your department scurry back to the old law and say, okay, these people will go under the first, under the old thing, and we can use part of the new money for those grandfathered people. It seems that's one way of doing it. It seems to be simpler to my mind. Just start this new codified program on July 1st and clean up the backlog as best you can.
Yeah.
Right.
So if section 2 of the bill does call for such a transition in the implementation, and basically says that in the whatever the interim period is, the agency has the authority to combine the funds and continue to award incentives of the program as they existed until this new one comes online. And I think this date in the draft probably here should be July 1 anyway. I think that's just probably a mistake. I don't remember. Right. But I think the larger point to remember is that when you had written these in the past, you had always put in some lead time so that you could be sure that you had the opportunity to publicize and let people know about the availability. So, and then at a later date, start making grants to be, at the time, to be sure that, the incentive was what was motivating people to move because they knew about the program and et cetera. So I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'd like to, Mr. Chair, it's Allison. I'd like to tag on to that, which is my concern, which we've talked about, is also we have so many people who can afford to be here during COVID. I don't want to, inadvertently finance COVID refugees who are perfectly capable of affording moving here on their own.
Right.
So it's sort of, for me, this is a fine line. I definitely want to move it to July 1st and we use up the money that we have, but I don't know how we can get at that population and not just give money to people who don't need it.
Well, I have a comment later on about the second home issue that was raised.
Right.
Now you're changing it to January 1st, 2022.
Well, I'm trying to jog my memory. I wonder if maybe it was the year that was incorrect here. But I'm sorry if that's adding to the confusion.
But that goes to your question, David, which is how much lead time, given that the programs have already been created in part, not necessarily unified, but does the department need 6 months to boot it up and be ready and market it, and then be ready to be on the ground ready offering it to January of next year? Or are they going to be ready July 1?
I think the program is basically already booted up.
Right.
Been in existence for a while. I think the department, I would be disappointed if the department couldn't, to the fullest extent possible, get the rest of the money out the door before July 1. And I think they should be greenlighting the tweaks we're making to this program on July 1. And if the bill gets signed in May, they'll have 2 months to, I don't think they have to do too much publicity because the program's out there already. People are aware of it, and that's our usual start date. I would leave it at July 1 for now, and we'll get to David's transition. I'm glad to hear that there's flexibility given to the department later on in this bill, but I think the codification, the combining, and the relaunching of the program with new monies should start July 1st.
That all, of course, is fine. I can do that. The syncing up the date should be no problem. Usually we wouldn't put a date into the statute if it's going to be a permanent program, and we just take care of that with the effective date and with the transition provisions. But we can work with that later. I think it's most important for me to understand how you want it to work, and then I can write it to reflect how you want it to work.
Okay, let's move on.
May I just interrupt for a second with a question?
Sure.
David, I had asked you.
By the way, I can't see people, so.
That's okay. David, I'd asked you to do a draft amendment to better target the jobs, particularly of those who are coming to work for Vermont employers for existing jobs. Have you had any chance to draft and do any drafting?
I'm sorry, I know I haven't written anything further on this particular bill. I apologize.
Yeah, because my concern, and Michael, you and I know have talked about this, is the targeting of the bill, and particularly by reducing the bifurcation of the bill, it makes it even more difficult to target. I have no problem, as I mentioned before, with targeting remote workers who bring jobs into Vermont that don't exist. I've got a big problem about a bill, particularly one that's going to be active during, let's say, July 1 of this year, where we're still in the midst of a pandemic, bringing workers in to fill jobs offered by Vermont employers that will compete with the large number of Vermonters who are already unemployed.
May I interrupt, Senator Bach? May I interrupt? We're going to get to that. It's in my annotations, that specific.
Okay.
Right.
And it does get a little confusing of whether you start with the date or the subject matter first, but trust me, it's later on in the bill. I identified specifically the issue you've raised, which I share your concern. So we're going to get to that, and we're going to modify that, I guess. Okay. Let's go on, David.
All right. The annual report would be on or before December 15th, describing implementation, promotion, utilization. I think you wrote return on investment here.
Yeah, what I was trying to get is, Senator Brock and I have been very keen on trying to put numbers in terms of revenue brought to the state. And I noticed the governor in his speech talked about, the rate of return for how much money's been put out there. So I don't know whether in the report, it talks about analysis of the utilization and performance of the program. I guess, I don't know if it needs something like including, but not limited to, the return of investment on the amount of money put out. I leave that to committee to discuss it. Obviously, if the program is successful and the department wanted to keep it going, that would be the highlight of their performance of the program. But I don't know if we want to specifically require them to report on that. How do you
Well,
feel about that, Senator Brock?
To me, it's a pretty key piece of this. We need to track, and it's an effort to keep tracking. I mean, this data is critically important for our building on the program and doing other programs like this. So I believe the department has done a reasonably good job tracking the remote worker beneficiaries. And I think we need to continue to track and collect data for the, I don't know how long you want to ask the department to do that for, but for at least 5 years to find out, how's it working, what new revenue is coming in, and all the different areas in which.
This is an annual report, so
yeah,
they'll be doing that. So I guess I would put in somehow get in the term return on investment. The only thing I don't like about it is return on investment usually talks about dollars, and there's even more return on investment to this program in terms of bringing,
kids to schools. Yeah.
Kids to school, cultural things. Yeah.
Can I just comment a bit? I know that just to be clear what we're tracking, right? We track who has come in and received a grant. And then we issue surveys about family size and age and a number of different data points. Return is really an estimate because we are not looking at their tax returns. We do not have access to that information. So I'm not sure. I want to be sure that whatever you are imparting on us to report, that we are actually able to report that. So I just want to understand how precise, like we do estimates based on what a family or what a person is expected to generate in revenues to the state, just the same way we model revenues from job creation or revenues in any other type of economic model. So just want that to be stated so that there's not an expectation that we're getting tax revenue data. We don't have access to that. There's no way we can get access to that.
Why don't you work with David on language? Maybe throw the word estimate in there. I mean, the governor managed to throw out in his speech a return on investment. So you must have something out there that you used. So
it's a modeling exercise. So just so that everyone knows, it's an estimate.
Thank you. That's helpful. I thought we were actually tracking real revenue, and it would be great if we could figure out a way for tax to participate in providing real revenue on an aggregated basis. So if you took all the remote workers, let's say in 1 year, or all of these in 1 year, and they gave you the total figure, not individualized, but the total figure of what that income generated, we could conceivably work on getting some of that way, because I think it's gonna, anyway, I think that's important data to collect.
We could talk to tax about it. If we sent a list, would they give us the aggregate? Yeah, we could do that.
So bear in mind that you're not
but
just
there's a lag, Sorry.
I said, you're not just talking though about the income tax revenue that's coming in. There are some things which you are going to have to be doing some estimates ranging from the employment of spouses, for example. Would that be included in the information you get from the tax department, or would that be something that you would estimate? would property taxes, would consumption taxes, would other kinds of revenue that also is part of the return on investment, those I think would have to be estimated. And so the only question in terms of return on investment, whether you simply say in the bill that you will develop a program and present it to the committee at the end of the first year, detailing how you would do the reporting going forward, or you would put something a little bit more granular in as to what return on investment means in the bill. And perhaps you and David could work that out as to which is the best approach.
Yeah, Randy, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think it's the whole kit and caboodle. You're absolutely right. It's the total revenue impact of these people coming to Vermont, because we know it fans out and has a big net.
And that is a model and exercise. So yes, we could probably do that more readily than anything involving tax. So
I think you get the flavor of what the committee would
Sure.
like to see and the challenges you face. So see if you can come up with some language to add that to the annual report.
I have another thing, if I may interject, just so that I'm not sure where it belongs in here, but perhaps here we did want a set aside of $100,000.
No, it's-
It is in here. Okay.
No, well, actually, it's not in here, but this morning I forgot to copy you. I wrote the committee saying, I forgot to put the set aside in my annotations. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't know where that goes, quite frankly, but it may go in the appropriations section
Okay.
if there will be in the bill.
And remind us, Joan, the set aside is for what?
It's to increase the minority and ethnic group
That's right.
representation.
Right. Thanks.
And does that assume that you're over subscribed? Have you thought how you would, well, if you set it aside, I guess the money would just sit there if it wasn't used. And I guess you're thinking that if it's the $500,000 the governor suggested, if 400,000 got used and there was still demand, that money on the set aside would just carry over to the next year?
Well, actually, we thought that if it wasn't utilized by at least a quarter before year end, that it would blend into the general appropriation, just so that we're not left with underutilized funds, especially when there's demand elsewhere.
Does anybody have a problem with that concept and approach? Because I think we can just, because we need to move on, so we could dispense with that and just, again, charge Joan and David to come up with language and a place to put that in the bill. It's pretty isolated or separate, so.
Mr. Chair, I don't have a problem with it. I would just want to continue the conversation with ACCD outside of committee about where and how they advertise this program, because the word of mouth and kind of networks of BIPOC Americans are really different than, I think where we've traditionally marketed and communicated. So I'd love to hear how their efforts are going to try and build new communication channels to people around the country. Because I think sometimes we say, oh, it just wasn't successful, but most people might not be aware.
Right. Well, I would think, some of that stuff is dovetails nicely with statutory language. Other of it deals with you putting pressure on them or writing a letter. But it wouldn't be hard in the section we deal with this to talk about education and outreach, put a spotlight on that for those populations. Anyhow, let's move on. We're on section E. David?
All right, so subsection E, the definitions. Remember, we have the concept of qualifying employee in this legislation. It's one of two different classes of worker. And the first one here is new relocating worker. And that's a person who on or after a date becomes a full-time resident of the state, becomes a full-time employee of a business domiciled or authorized to do business in the state. Then, under C, it's employed in one of these occupations identified by DOL in that long-term occupational projection document that we looked at in committee a few years ago. At one of the top occupations at each level of educational attainment, typical for entry. And
Okay,
I see you have a note
no.
here.
Let me interrupt, David. Before we get to this, which is one of Senator Brock's questions, can you back up for a second? I have
Yep.
a couple of questions, not only with the date again, but
Yep.
explain to me, I think we sort of just let this language go. It's pretty loose. In B, becomes a full-time employee of a business domiciled or authorized to do business in the state. Okay. I apologize. I'm thinking to the next section on remote worker. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, what about the date again? We need to change the
Sure.
date again or
Well,
take it?
so
take it out?
I think that just, it sounds to me like because these programs already exist and we're going to take care of transitioning in the session law piece, it sounds like July 1st is what you want. So I think that just needs to be consistent throughout. Correct?
Yep. Yeah. And I hear you that we could just leave it out altogether and it would become effective after July 1st, but this is somewhat confusing of all the
Yep.
moving session laws. So I think it's okay to say it again. So,
All right. So you would have to both become a full-time resident and become a full-time employee of a business that's either domiciled or authorized to do business here. C goes to, what is the type of position that qualifies? And let me just look at the two of them together, and then you can discuss it. It's either you are employed in one of those occupations specified in that labor report, or the agency determines should otherwise receive an incentive grant under the program because the worker possesses exceptional education, skills, or training, or due to other extraordinary circumstances. So I'll leave off with this. I'm remembering the discussion when this program was first being developed in the committee and looking through that Department of Labor report. And then the consensus, the feeling at the time was, what about other people who aren't necessarily specified in the report, but have some other skill that we really need? So you added in the flexibility in C2 there. I heard commissioners say last hearing, they don't love that. And you've noted here, do you want to identify specific professions with a catch-all for ACCD to determine that are in similar demand? So I guess the question in C is, what job should qualify?
okay. So the question for the committee, I think, is not only do we want to move away from the long-term occupational projections, but David didn't even get to the financial qualifications of the job of 140% or 160% later down. What I heard from the department, and I think I didn't hear any objection from the committee, is to scrap this entire section and substitute it with some qualifying types of jobs like nurses, education, and I think retail. I think I've heard that the ACCD has done this in maybe other areas where they've given priority. So maybe we could come up with a list. I don't know if we want to keep, if you can go up a little bit to that catch-all thing. This is sort of more individual based, I guess, to the worker, but also to do it to a profession that we don't list that, all of a sudden jumps out to ACCD as being in great demand
Yeah,
to add them to their list. So
Mr.
I just opened the conversation with that. I think this whole section needs to be reworked, but if we could come up with a concept of what we're trying to achieve, we can send David
Right.
and out to draft it.
Mr. Chair, it's Allison.
Yeah.
I feel uncomfortable in statute identifying specific areas. We need a lot of people coming in all sorts of areas. And I think the department, we could ask the department in concert maybe with the legislature to annually review priority areas. But I think it would be inappropriate in statute to tie them to those areas now, because as you said, a year from now, it may be very different, or 2 years from now. So, I mean, I think what we're looking for is more people at with higher incomes and skills, training, and expertise that they're bringing, all those resources and assets they're bringing to the state. And that could be in a variety of jobs. And so I would feel uncomfortable being too specific in statute.
Right. Well, the two things is the counter argument to that, which I'm sure Senator Brock will give us, but in terms of the optics, but in terms of putting something in statute, we could draft it in a way that, tells the generic things we're looking for and leave it to procedures to be updated annually in terms of identifying jobs that are in need. This, in some ways, this goes back a lot to our discussions around economic recovery grants, how best to target them, how refined can you make it. You could leave it like everybody can come in, or you can do some thing like this that's in here now, which doesn't necessarily tie into the need for out-of-staters to come here. And then you're not targeting the money as best you can, and you're taking jobs potentially away from Vermonters. So how do we achieve that balance?
Yeah.
Senator Brock, do you want to weigh in? I mean, I know you have optic concerns
I
about.
just wonder whether or not the Department of Labor might have some statistical data as to the types of jobs or job classifications, SIC codes, and so on, where there are a significant number of vacancies or some measure of vacancies in Vermont that would separate them from jobs in which there are lots of Vermonters ready and able or in the workforce who are unemployed who could fill them. I mean, that's the separation that I'm really looking for. And yeah, you want to layer onto it that we perhaps are not looking for a large number of people who are in minimum wage jobs who are moving here, because that doesn't really help our economy. People who would come here and benefit from a program and then become dependent upon us. That obviously would make a lot of sense. But I would think that we could qualitatively talk about the kinds of jobs and set up some measure that the department could use that would be relatively easy to apply just based on job codes.
Joan?
Yeah, I was just going to, there are a couple of contradictions in the way it works right now, right? So one of the most in-demand jobs are cashiers, right? It doesn't pay 160% a minimum. Does it mean we don't need them as much? Somebody at the lower wage end needs more help to move into Vermont. Do we need them? Do we want them? I think that question has to be answered before we start really itemizing and targeting the types of jobs. I think we all think that it's better to target, right? When in fact, I'm hard pressed to find an employer who said that he has found everybody he needs within the state of Vermont, even at this more enhanced or increased level of unemployment. I was just on a phone yesterday with a business. They want to grow by 60 people. They cannot find them anywhere. So I think I'm with Senator Clarkson in that we don't really want to be tied to specific fields just because the need is so vast across the broad spectrum. And what we found in practice is we get job titles that aren't on the occupational projection, but then are hard pressed to tell the employer they didn't really need this person. So there are statistics that speak to the macro trends, let's say, and then there are individual employers who need employees.
Right.
So I think I come back to the overarching theme, which is, what is our overarching theme? We want more population.
Yeah.
We need more workforce in general. I mean, it's weird that with all this unemployment, the unemployment rate is so low. It means people have dropped out of the workforce. So I think in totality, it should be that we want to bring people in. We really don't want to eliminate folks from this, just because they're in a profession that isn't named by this projection, which at best is just a projection.
Yeah.
And then the contradiction of the wage requirement feels odd, because we understand the wage requirement when we're paying an employer, because the employer should pay their employees X amount. But to prevent someone from moving in just because they're making a minimum wage, I think it goes against what the initial intent is on this. And as we found with remote worker, we get plenty of high wage people. So it could balance itself out, I don't think. Go ahead.
I think, though, that it is very, very difficult to tell a taxpayer that we're going to import somebody who earns $11 an hour as a cashier, and we're going to pay them up to $4,000 to move here. I think that's a no sale to the taxpayer.
I do wonder if it's, I'm struggling with tying it to the minimum wage, because I think some of these jobs, they need to pay people more to get them into these jobs. But I wonder if we could instead, if there's a measure for when you don't fall off the benefit cliff, like if we have some kind of agreed upon index for when you are out of range of requiring benefits to maintain stability.
Well, I think, though you have a point. The point that I think you've touched on is this, is it the state's responsibility to make up the wage difference for an employer who cannot hire people in the job, when it, to me, is the employer's responsibility to raise the wage rate until that job can be filled. Now, I realize there's difficulty for employers to do that in certain kinds of businesses, but that to me is a factor of economics. I don't believe it's the state's job to subsidize low-wage employers.
But we do that now, Randy. We do that now. I mean, that's what all our assistance programs are doing. You're filling the gap between what employers are willing to pay and what employees make.
I think, though, that when you move to the issue of not just dealing with people who are employees or who are citizens here who are having difficulty making ends meet, that's one thing. And that's the kind of subsidy you're referring to. Here, you're talking about doing an active subsidy of importing people who fit that category and then paying them out of the taxpayers, out of the pockets of the taxpayers who are right now in the middle of a pandemic, hard pressed to do that. I just don't think that's a saleable proposition, and I don't think it's a right one.
So one alternative that I could suggest, I don't know if it's going to satisfy anyone, is to go with the open-ended approach, but mandate that the department take sort of informal, not rigid steps, but informal steps in advertising or whatever to say in their thing that we are especially looking for nurses, or especially looking for the kinds of folks that they identify as being jobs that are difficult to fulfill. I mean, they could even, make mention of the wage rate if they wanted to, but nothing that rigidly prohibits somebody else from coming along and applying. I think it would have some impact on the pool of applicants, but that might be one way of going. I'm trying to,
Well, I think that may be one factor, Mr. Chair, but I also think there ought to be a factor that talks about that in effect tests and requires that for an employer who has a job that it cannot fill, that it perhaps certifies to the department that it has actually gone out and looked for Vermonters to fill those jobs, whether it be through advertising, through whatever. We can create and affect some measure for that. But by simply saying to the employee who's coming from out of state, we're going to pay you $4,000 to move here, we have no idea whether or not the job that he or she is applying for, we know the job is open. We don't know whether the employer has done anything to fill it with Vermonters who are unemployed.
So, yeah.
I think, Senator Clarkson, I think my feeling is that while I hear you and empathize what you're saying, practically speaking, until we really fund this program at a level that's robust, I do feel we should try and do something to target it to jobs that are really in demand. And I just like we're talking about offers to rehire in the unemployment situation, I have no problem adding a requirement here, because the employer benefits obvious as well as the employee, for the employer to say in the application, yes, I've tried, or however it's phrased, I've made some attempt to fill this job locally. We'll still spend all of this money at this level, regardless if we put that criteria in.
Well, I think we can put, I think you can ask in statute that annually the department in partnership with the legislature sets priority areas, target areas, but to target those areas now in statute, I just think ties our hands in a way that,
No,
I'm not sure you want 5 years from now.
I'm not suggesting that.
Oh, okay.
You convinced me of that if we were to do that kind of targeting, it would be annually updated by the department based upon guidelines. We say we wouldn't necessarily name the professions. We'd leave them to follow our guidelines and metrics, and they would come up with those. But
right.
So I wouldn't put it in statute. I agree.
Well, one of the things, though, that we're also talking about here is eliminating, I believe, it's been proposed that we eliminate some of the criteria that's in the bill now, such as the criteria of gross wages exceeding 160% of the state minimum wage. Is there still the intent to remove that language by the committee?
That's being suggested by the department. Quite frankly, I think we're gonna have a tough time with the House on that one. They put that in. It sounds like it's something you would like to.
Well, absolutely, because I just simply see, regardless of the need for cashiers, I think it would not be good public policy for us to incentivize paying minimum wage people to come to Vermont to become yet a further burden on us if that minimum wage a person does not need enough to live without additional state assistance.
Right. I actually agree with Randy on that. I think that the optics on that are tough. And I would ask Joan, with your employers that have cashier needs, for example, do you grill them on what they're offering in terms of pay and what they, because I think Randy's right. I mean, if they can't find them, it's probably because they're paying them too little. And at what point do we?
I think it sounds like the committee needs to talk to a few of the industry groups. We have not had retailers come in to us and say that. We've had the Retail Association say that the retailers are unable to find employees. And as we all know, the Vermont minimum is higher than our neighbors. So I agree with everything that's being said. I understand the intent. I think in actuality, though, the need for cashiers is a documented statistic. It's not necessarily that I'm saying that we need cashiers. It's just the problem with the stats is that it doesn't take care of the individual employer need. Yes, I think simplistically, one could say, just pay them more and they'll come. Yes, that's what we think. And that's generally all our incentive programs for employers definitely promulgate that they need to pay 160, and all of that is true. This is, I think, a little different in that we're helping the individual move. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and you definitely want to target it. I just am hard pressed to find an employer who feels that there is sufficient workforce in the state of Vermont. period. I mean, even
Right.
now with the unemployment rate, and all postings are typically online. So every Vermonter has the same ability to apply that a non-Vermonter would. So I understand the intent and the spirit of it. I think industry may paint a different picture.
Well,
A lot of times we have occupations that we say, we need nurses, we need educators, we need tradesmen, we need manufacturing personnel, we need software developers, we need everybody. Like, it is
Right.
so
right.
broad that it's so difficult. And yeah, so I think I've said
Yeah.
enough, you know where I stand.
No, we need everybody.
Well,
I think we hear that loud and clear.
I think what we need to understand is put this in perspective, how small this program is. We've had
Yeah.
no problem bumping up against the spending limits. My understanding is that the wage rates of people who have applied far exceeds the ones that are in the law right now. There haven't been people who I think have, or many people we are aware of that have applied that couldn't get in because they were making wages that were too low. And for better or worse, one of the selling points of this program, which this committee has embraced, is the return on investment. If we turn this into less of a return on investments, we're going to have a heavier lift, and I know we're going to have a heavier lift with the House. I don't think these numbers are outrageous by any means. In some ways they're still an embarrassment. 140% of the minimum wage is like $15 an hour.
Yeah, it's pretty modest.
So I'm okay with leaving this as is, especially if we need to move this along. So
I hear you, Mr. Chair. I'm just thinking, I mean, what I remember when I was on House General is we still set a kind of a basic needs budget every year, and we agreed upon the figure because our JFO had come up with it. And it was at least a way to say this person's basic needs, are taken care of, and that's a pretty good measure of a good employer and a good wage. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know how it would relate to this.
This probably is right around the basic needs budget.
Right.
Well, remember that the basic needs budget is not the livable wage. I'm sorry. I mean, basic needs budget is still way low.
Well, yeah, it is low, and this is not high. 140% of minimum wage is not high. I bet you it's probably, maybe higher than the basic needs budget. It's probably lower than the livable wage. So, I tend to agree with Senator Brock in the sense that, the employer community is being helped here by this program and bring the folks here. So I've always been a big fan. If we're going to subsidize employers, let them pay,
Right.
a fixed wage. So
I think it's $16.45
right.
for the 140%, just so we have that figure on hand.
Yeah.
Very
Right.
close. Okay, so let's leave that stuff in, and we've assigned David and Joan to deal with subsection C. Can we move on, David? Okay, I got this now. Okay, so we're going to change the date here again. Let's move down to C. Qualifying and expenses. On qualifying expenses, just to summarize, because we're getting near the end here, is the department or the agency wants to just do relocating expenses. But on the other hand, I listened to the tape again. You also suggested that it was important to keep the expense for using co-working spaces. So I think maybe
I think that's a fair.
At least for people who are working for out-of-state firms, they should have like the first year of co-working expenses paid for or something like that. I think that's important. And then just do all relocation expenses, which we elaborate on a little bit. It's more than just United Van Lines. It's like first month rent deposit and things like that. So do you want to say some more on that, Joan?
Sure. I think the most of the expenses were relocation expenses, where it starts taking a lot more time to administer is when people submit expenses that they say are necessary to perform their duties. And then we have to judge, well, why do they have those expenses in Vermont and not elsewhere? So that's an uncomfortable position for the department to be in, to judge that. And so really, at the end of the day, it's moving expenses we think are the most important. The co-working space is important because we want to support those spaces. And, some of them are having a hard time, especially now with COVID. So that's, computer software and hardware, I really do think we need to delete that. Whoever wrote that in caps, that's great.
Yeah, that was our chair.
Yeah.
I would agree with that, but I do think it's important to have broadband upgrades. Until we have great internet to every home, it may require a broadband upgrade. I think the co-working space is a very useful addition also. And then what's 5? Isn't there a 5? Were there only 4? Oh, okay. Yeah, we'd reduced it to 4.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest that, Joan, you work with David to rewrite 1 through 4. It sounds like the committee, and I'm in agreement, relocation expenses, and somehow, maybe you can tie into, as an example of a relocation expense, some narrow expenses for broadband and for co-working space, and we'll get rid of the equipment and tools. But I agree that we have, situations where people, the difference of whether they come here or not is maybe they really, want to move to the Northeast Kingdom and there's poor broadband, and we want to encourage people to move to the Northeast Kingdom. So let's help them for a little while with their broadband. Let's not get into, you can, given the experience you had and the critique that I'm not a big fan of from the auditor, let's avoid the situations where people run, a half a mile of underground fiber at, $20,000. But figure out some way to squeeze that in terms of language of qualifying expenses. Anything from committee members on that before we move on? Because we're running out of time. Let's go on, David.
Can I just flag and make sure you're still okay with, here in new remote worker, the definition is full-time employee of a business with its domicile or primary place of business within or outside Vermont?
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem I actually had. Now you highlight to, why would we say within? We have.
Remember that this language was added specifically because people wanted to include the person that works remotely for a Burlington business but lives, for instance, in the Kingdom. That's why those 2 words were added.
So I think with the inclusion of relocated worker, we get around that problem. I would keep it just outside of Vermont, because what we're trying to do is target outside Vermont businesses with relocated workers here, I believe, and that I think relocated worker could address a Vermont employee who works remotely for a Vermont business.
Well, on the other hand, I mean, we'd be changing the law from what we had already decided, and the key is that they do come from out of state.
Does that say that here? Does it say that they have to come here?
Yeah, it does in subsection B. And then they do have to work remotely from a home office or co-working.
Okay, right.
It's not,
Right.
It's not as offensive as I thought it was. So let's just leave it. Because it'll treat them.
Okay.
So on that point, you had flagged below the issue of the second homeowners, and all of the definitions say that you have to become a full-time resident of the state after the date certain. So
Right.
I don't know why that wouldn't capture the same issue. I mean, even if you were, I guess, what do you want to do there? Even if you have a second home, you're not a full-time resident of Vermont. So, I don't know.
Correct. Correct.
Well,
I-
I mean, I hear
mean-
Joan's point, though. I mean, I think if people have a second home, first of all, they're probably fairly well-to-do, and second of all, they're probably, if they're going to move, if they're going to take a job here remotely from another state, they're probably got one or both legs already here. And so why are we needing to incentivize them anymore? I agree with Joan. If we can find some language to have that be a factor somehow, why don't you, Joan, come back to us with something?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank-
we'll figure something out. I mean, they're particularly problematic if they already have a residence, and then the way the statute was written is like, sure, they became a full-time resident, but if they already had a second home, why are we paying for any of these things? So
I think that's critically important, because if you have a second home here, a second home is a luxury. A second home is something only people with
Mhm.
means afford. So I do not think we need to be using taxpayer dollars to finance somebody who is already here part-time and who wants to be here full-time.
I'm gonna, because of where we are in the schedule, if it's okay with committee members, I will, or Allison will work off, Allison's gonna be the reporter of this bill. We'll work with David on this transition language to get it right. And-
I am? I thought
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No,
Randy is. I thought-
Randy is, if you could work with David to get the transition language right, assuming we're going forward. But before the next time we take this up, perhaps that would be helpful. I think we've cut. Joan, is there anything else that you see that we haven't covered at this point?
I don't think so, but I'll give it a once over and coordinate with David and Senator Brock.
Okay.
All
great.
right, thanks.
Terrific.
Is everybody okay before we take a break? Any other questions?
Oh, about 88, but for the moment, we're good. I'm gonna go do my jumping jacks.
Okay, we'll come back in 10 minutes. Thanks, everybody.